I've become involved in this project looking at my mother's influence on me as an artist through being involved in Studio 10 with IMMA. And I suppose IMMA has been a really important place for me for the last 30 years, really. But especially in the last few years when I've moved back to live with my mother. And I actually lost my own studio space in that move. And I was looking for somewhere where I could just make art, and I discovered the Studio 10 project and the wonderful group of people there, some of whom were around the same age as my mum. And it's just been a really, really good experience. So I'm delighted to contribute to this as a Studio 10 participant. And just to say a little bit about my mother, she's from West Cork and from a village in West Cork called Ballineen, which is still a really, really important place to her. Even though as a family, when she was very young, they emigrated to the north of England, where she spent a lot of her formative years and where she was educated. They always came back to Ballineen, like so many, I suppose, Irish immigrants, and all her stories really are from that village in West Cork. So I feel a sense of connection there as well through her. My mum is a really important person in all our lives. She's a very clever lady, she's very curious, and she's very, very caring. So I suppose one of the stories she tells me about, and I think it's really typical of her as a young mother, was being on a bus with me in Dublin when I was about 3 years old, and somebody in the bus just leaned over and said, "I don't know how you put up with that child. She never stops talking and asking questions." And my mum just said she loved it. She loved how many questions I asked, and that I always ask why again, when she gave the answer, but why? And she always had time for our questions. There was just myself and my sister, and growing up in the 60s in Dublin, there was certainly never a feeling from either of my parents that we would have to go into certain jobs because we were girls. We were just encouraged to do whatever we wanted to do. But I think for my parents, they were very, very protective of both of us. And I think the art world felt like a very sort of dangerous, unstable place. I did find my way into the art world by a kind of a circuitous route, and I actually became an art therapist. And that's where I've worked for most of my life as an art therapist in palliative care. But I have continued, I always say it's a bit like a shrewfree talamh, a little underground stream, to make my own art. And usually in whatever house we lived, I had a little space for doing that. But then in 2019, I moved back to Dublin to be with my mother, to support her a little bit. And I suppose I lost that space, and that's where I got involved then in Studio 10. And since then, I just want to add that I actually have, during this COVID time, converted my mum's garage into a studio. So now I have a studio space back in my mother's house, which feels very circular and very right. I never really thought about the influence that my mother had on my actual art making, because I suppose it was such a sort of a private part of my life in a way for a lot of years. And it was when my own daughter, Siún Ní Argáin, went to art college in NCAD, and she became really fascinated by this idea of a maternal line, I suppose, just looking at how art had been passed down in the family, because there was such a strong connection between her art and my art. And then she was looking back to my mother as maybe the source of this sort of female creativity. I try and make art in a very daily way, so it's a very kind of, I try and have a sort of a daily practice. And my mother is a very disciplined person, and she would have things that she does every day, or ways of doing things that are very regulated. And she also, another idea that just came to me was that we both really take quite a lot of pleasure in small things. We're not people who are looking for sort of epic journeys, more just really enjoying something that's happening on an everyday basis. And I suppose getting involved in this project has connected some of those dots for me. And I think as well, living really closely with my mother during the lockdown allowed me to sort of start making maybe some art about our relationship. And the first piece of that was the poem that I wrote. Every night, last thing, my mother laid for morning. Coming down bedhead, rubbing sticky eyes, the smiling table offered me an easy invitation to the day. It was a ritual I tried to emulate, but I'm an early to bed, early to rise girl and cannot face a chore so late at night. Each year my resolution falters by the spring, and while the kettle sings, I fetch the cup and plate. My mother likes to lie in late, her guilty pleasure being to stretch and turn and doze. But she comes to the table spick and span. She tells me that her father was a Navy man. Living together again, time and space are shifting. Mum no longer lays the table every night. In the morning when I'm done, I sweep the crumbs and lay a setting for her noonday rising.